So let's get started. When you think about interviewing, it's actually a process, and I'm sure all of you know this. I will focus on all parts, or at least the major parts of the process in this presentation. And when you think of a process, right, there's usually a timeline, and some things come before, some things happen in parallel, something comes after. This is what a basic idea of this process looks like. You would want to update your resume, do a job search, practice, and as Sharon said, maybe even practice some low-risk interviews that aren't anything at stake, that you have no interest in that position, or you simply want to get some feedback, and then negotiate and accept a final offer, typically is part of the process. As we go through here, I said I'll touch on all of these, but if there's any one in particular you'd like to focus on, again, just speak up. So in the resume, there's three core things you should think about: content, character, and current. In the content, it seems pretty obvious. Focus on results and impact, relevant skills, and keywords. Keywords may be not so important for everybody's resume, but if you're certainly looking for a technical position or an entry-level position that might have certain skills that are very unique or specific to the role, you do want to think about keywords. So when I say focus on results and impact, many of us tend to say, I contributed to, I worked on, I participated in our resumes. But really what you want to highlight is you achieved, you led, you brought X revenue to the organization. You want to think of in terms of what was the outcome, not the activities that you did, but what was the outcome of the activities that you did. And on your resume, capture that outcome, because all of us have achievements and have contributed to the different roles we've had. Even if it's an entry-level position, we don't have too many folks on the call here who are very early in their career. So all of us have had at least one position or one type of responsibility or career experience. So in that, as you think back on it, what were the outcomes and the results that happened? Or it could be, what was the impact? You know, in Linda's case, one of the outcomes might have been her influence on the customers. Like, she, through her work, right, she was the face of the company. Through her work, she brought X number of employees. Or as Sharon said, she advanced 23 students to be able to obtain a job. Whatever that is, what is the result that you can capture? Not the work that you did, that I met with the students, not that, you know, you helped review their resumes, although those are important, but I think people get that you did those things if you can show a result. And that's what I also mean by relevant skills. Relevant to not only the role you had, but also the role you want. And so it can sound daunting, because you might be thinking, oh my goodness, you're saying I'm going to have to customize my resume for all these positions because they might be asking for different things. Maybe, but the tweaks might be very minor, and ultimately most positions look for a core set of skills, right? Ability to, you know, work in a team, to accomplish the task, to be able to navigate complex situations, to be able to find solutions. If you can think about those as relevant skills, then you're much more likely to be able to capture that on your resume. And then identify keywords, especially when I'm looking for an engineer. If I'm looking for an embedded software engineer specifically, I want to know that they've worked on microcontrollers, microprocessors, and C, rather than that I did software engineering. So in certain roles, it is important to identify keywords, and in certain roles, keywords don't matter. So maybe you're thinking, wait, if I have all these keywords on my resume, what about the impact and results, and where did that go? The other reason to include they're tied together. And the other reason to include keywords, especially if you're looking to apply online, if you're not really getting your resume in front of a person or in front of somebody human reading through it, you want to make sure you get through that first online screening. A lot of technical jobs, when you apply online, they go through a resume screener, matching keywords that a manager has put in there against the words that are on your resume. And if they don't match, you tend not even to get in front of the manager. So it's important to think about what kind of company you're applying to, what kind of position you're applying to, and change your content based on that. So my advice for somebody who may be technical or may have certain broad breadth, and you might be looking for a couple of different kinds of jobs, is to have 2 or 3 variants of your resume. One might be a normal person, human readable resume that doesn't have all these keywords, that really highlights your achievements and your results and your skills in a broader general sense. One that might be tailorable, like you have certain phrases in there that you can tailor based on the application you're looking at, and one that might be keyword heavy that you can use for your application online, so that you're not feeling like you have to constantly craft a resume. You just look at which of the 3 is most applicable to the way you're applying for the position. Any questions on that part so far? Sharon.
So will you be addressing cover letters, or they don't use them anymore?
It really depends. Most people don't use cover letters anymore because you're either sending an email, which I suppose you can view that as the cover letter, but they should be much shorter than traditional cover letters used to be. If you're sending an email saying, I'm attaching my resume, you want it to be only 2 or 3 sentences. This is the position I'm applying for. I have this experience in 1 sentence that was extremely applicable, and please see my attached resume. You don't want to give a lot of detail anymore. And certainly if you're applying online, the cover letters almost don't matter. I know that at my company, you can upload a cover letter, you can upload a resume, you can upload even supporting documents. But to be honest, I have never looked at a cover letter, and I will tell you, if I open a cover letter and it's 2 pages, I typically delete that candidate because they clearly don't have an appreciation for how to be targeted and understand that I'm not likely to read the 2 pages of a cover letter.
So what about the length of the resume itself then? Does that have to be 1 page?
1 to 2 pages, depending on where you are in your career. I honestly got a resume that was 56 pages one time.
Oh my God.
56 pages. Again, delete. There was no way that person could have been more than suitable for my position. However, they clearly did not understand how to convey their information in less than 56 pages, which I don't need to be reading emails from that individual as a normal course of business that are 3 to 4 pages. So it was no. But depending on where you are in your career, 1 to 2 pages. Entry level, certainly maybe through 5, 10 years of experience. 1 page is usually sufficient. 2 pages for more experienced individuals. Any other questions?
How far back would you want to list the positions that you've had? How many years?
Yeah, so you jumped into the current category, right? That you are not required to list every single job you've had. And it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. Typically, many of us have job journeys, right? Our journeys in our career go through different types of roles. We may rarely have the same exact type of job over and over and over again. Certainly on my resume, I started out as a technical individual contributor, and now I'm very much management, supervisor, director level. So I don't include my first job where I was doing really highly technical stuff. And the only, actually I have it, but it's 1 line as a place of employment and indicates that I was an electrical engineer, and that's it. There are no details beneath it because it's not relevant for any job that I would look for today. So there is no need or necessity of including every job. if you have changed careers, only list the jobs that are applicable. You might do the trick I just indicated of the one line to just show you have employment history, but you don't need to add any detail under that. And it's also okay to split your job experience. There's no need that it needs to be chronological. You can bundle jobs with similar types of work that you did together that emphasize, you know, you have this body of background and experience. So you don't have to date those positions. You don't have to date when you graduated. You don't need to do that. I would say if you're very junior and you only have one or two, then it's probably important to show like whether it was an internship, a co-op, or an actual job. That might be important. So quickly looking at a resume, I can get that information. But if you've got more than 5, definitely 10, almost it's not as relevant. And especially that sort of information comes out in the conversation. So in the currency, you know, you can think about what do you want to include. And I really, so another situation, I saw a resume. This individual had worked in engineering, and then they were 3 years doing Boy Scout camp counseling. And, you know, it wasn't a bad thing that it was on the resume, but it was sort of like, why? And to be honest, at the end of all of the interviews, all of the interviewers asked him why, and it had nothing to do with what he wanted to pursue or the job he was trying to do. So it really just distracted everybody and took time away from him emphasizing what his skills and background was, and sort of making us think like, okay, why this really strange? And if he had just left it out, you know, it wouldn't have mattered to any of the people interviewing him.
Thank you.
Steve.
So Nita, I'm curious if LinkedIn plays a role in the resumes you're looking at. Are you expecting a link to come along with the resume itself, or are you finding most of the people are submitting resumes that make it redundant, let's say their photos on it, or, you know, a lot of cross information?
Yeah, it really depends. I don't get a lot of links to LinkedIn. However, I do get a lot of messages in LinkedIn saying, here's my resume. Would you consider me? Could you refer me to? Can you give me input, or I'm interested in? So LinkedIn, if you are going to use it to reach out to people, make sure your profile is clean. Again, that it captures what it is that you want, or attach your resume. So in my LinkedIn profile, I have very little content there. It simply has a record of my work history, but it doesn't have the details of what I did at the work history. And I don't use LinkedIn. I like to actually talk to somebody and, you know, either show them a resume or hand them a resume. I think it also depends on what roles you're looking for. So LinkedIn is really good and useful for finding the entry point or a connection into the business. And a lot of people reach out to me saying, oh, I noticed that L3 Harris has this position. Can you link me to that manager? Or do you know anything about the position? Or can you submit a referral? And I think that's an awesome way to use LinkedIn, because it's getting you to the person that is actually going to do the evaluation. And then usually, you know, if I reply, say, send me your resume, I don't just forward a LinkedIn profile to somebody, because I found them to be very hit or miss and not really the detail that I might be looking for, even though the resume only has 2 or 3 extra bullets on there. All right, so I think we touched on content and currency, character. You know, this is a stylistic element or a preference for me, and I've read recently that the objective shouldn't be on the resume. There's a lot of sort of recent articles about it's very passé to have an objective, and I have to agree to that some extent. You know, when I see an objective, it's usually so banal, like I'm looking for a challenging position in engineering. It's like, well, duh, you wouldn't have applied here if you weren't looking for a challenging position in engineering. There's really very little in an objective. It usually says I'm looking for, well, that's pretty obvious if you're applying for the position. So instead of an objective, think about a professional statement, and it could be a reflection of your elevator speech. It could be a summary of the 1 or 2 achievements that you've had that highlight the skills that you would bring to an organization. My summary actually is, you know, pseudo trendy. I don't know how exact trendy it is, but pseudo trendy in that it's short phrases. It says professional engineer, project managed professional, and engineering, multidisciplinary engineering leader. So it's like 3 really short phrases, no complete sentences. And I say pseudo trendy because a lot of companies have moved to those kinds of taglines, right? Where they have, you know, 2 or 3 words that kind of describe them. And mine is 2 or 3 phrases that describe my background and what I might bring to an organization. So it doesn't have to be that way, but change it to a really short summary that highlights 1 example or 1 characteristic that you would bring to an organization. Not what you're seeking, but what you're bringing is how I differentiate an objective statement from the professional summary. And then you also want to have, you know, a clean resume. So a lot of people went to very fancy formatting on their resume, which is okay as long as it's transmittable. A lot of times I want to be able to cut and paste from a resume, and I might get a PDF that has, you know, a speaker profile on one side and then text over here. And that looks great because it looks very much like a marketing type of resume for an individual. But I find that it's very difficult for me to then transfer that information into, you know, a tool that I'm using or into a evaluation of the resume. So think about if you do have a nice formatted looking resume, that once you do make that initial contact, you can supply a simple text readable resume. And especially if you're applying online, you want to have a simple text readable resume. The fancy resumes get all scrambled with even the PDF conversion into text. It's not super great. And then you as a manager, me as a manager, get these gobbledygook some resumes that it's like, oh, I don't know what to do with it. Okay, that's another delete, right? There's certain things that just get deleted automatically. That's another one of them. So make it clean, simple, enough white space, you know, don't use 7-point font. I don't need to get my reading glasses out to see your resume. It just means you, again, couldn't boil it down to something simple enough. Very, you know, nicely structured, but if you do fancy, that's great. I think it can be eye-catching, but it's only eye-catching if it gets to the person in that format. And that's the tricky part about submitting online. Sometimes it doesn't get to the individual reviewing your resume in the format that you might have thought, because most tools nowadays scan the PDFs employees submit and then send, you know, either a text email or a linked email or put it into a database. And those fancy things just don't convert to databases very easily. But if you're handing a resume to somebody, or you're at a networking event, or you're posting it on, you know, as a picture, those look really good. But you could easily do that with a simple text with just some white space and some, you know, bullets and some spacing work. So a little bit about the resume. The next part of the timeline is the search. Search everywhere and anywhere. Network, apply, search. Like, so network means anywhere, everywhere. Tell people what you're looking for. I mean, there's a downside to that, is that people will then know. So if you're looking covertly, you want to be sure you're telling the people that aren't talking to the people that you don't want to know. So there's a little bit of a trickiness there, but otherwise tell anybody and everybody that you're looking for a position. Otherwise you won't get referrals, you won't get tips, you won't get indicators. And you know, there are a lot of resume search, job search boards. I think they're good if you know specifically what you want. If you don't, then maybe you want to actually use the search, which is a recruiter. And there are 2 types of recruiter. One type of recruiter is the one that's paid by the company that is eventually going to hire you. And another type of recruiter is that you pay so that they can find you a job. Very, very few jobs you need to pay somebody to help you find a job. So look for the recruiters that work for companies that basically their job is to take and do the pre-screening for the hiring manager. So sometimes if I'm looking for a very technical or specific skill set, I'll reach out to one of my recruiters that I know. They usually have a database of resumes, and usually these recruiters will probably talk to you, so they have also a sense of what are the key attributes and traits you have. And so when I say, Nita, as Nita, I need this, and I reach out to my recruiter, they'll say, oh, I have these 5 or 10 candidates, and I get them. And then if I were to hire one of them, they, we pay them because they recruited for us. Those apply to as many of those as you possibly can. Like, it does you no harm to be in multiple recruiter databases, and they will advocate for you, especially if you're very clear on the type of job you want. If you are just super open-ended, they're probably not as helpful, and a recruiter is probably not as helpful. You might as well use just the message boards or some online, or try to find somebody at the company that you can connect with. Any questions on the search part? All right, so the interview part, this is really why we're here, to talk about the interview part. And I broke it into 3, prepare, practice, and present. And we're gonna talk about the prepare first. There are a couple of things you want to do when you're preparing. One is to prepare your elevator speech. Now, this sounds hard. How many of you have an elevator speech? 3 out of 12. That's not too bad. How long is your elevator speech, Cindy? Survey.
It's like 1 to 2 minutes. It's like 1 to 2 lines.
Yeah, and what do you emphasize in it?
I work mine for health coaching. So working with people to get them to the healthiest form of themselves is what I do.
Yeah.
It's plain, simple, tells them a little bit what I do and leaves them hanging.
Beautiful, right? You don't give a lot of detail, and you're saying what you do, but you're really saying what you do and how it impacts other people. Back to the resume, right? You're talking about the impact or the results. You're not saying, I give guidance or I help you decide on things or things like that. You're saying this is what you enable. And that's a great way to construct an elevator speech. Steve, what did you create your elevator speech for?
Well, I'm in sales for a marketing company, so mine's very short. I usually typically have 20, 30 seconds to give it. And it's
you want to share it?
Comment, right. And the idea is that you're trying to lead them down the road to set up a meeting to go further in the selling process. So it's very short, but you have to communicate quickly everything you do in a nutshell. It's just as simple as that, or you'll lose them. And it cannot be flooded with language that clouds your true purpose.
Yeah, great points. So here's a very quick and short elevator speech if you want to make it 2 minutes, but I agree with Cindy and Steve. You could easily make it less than a minute and still convey everything you need to convey. Some action verb, so I enable warfighters to see in the dark. That's usually my elevator speech when I go to a networking event and people say, you enable warfighters to see in the dark. What does that mean? So normally somebody might say, oh, I'm the senior director of engineering at L3 Harris. I think, what does that mean? At least enabling warfighters in the dark gives you a sense of something intriguing and something that I'm actually impacting and accomplishing. So think of what you do in the terms of impact, like Cindy said, right? She enables or provides resources to, I forget exactly what you said, but the benefits of health and connecting to that. So an action verb, and a noun, like what do you do, or a phrase. And if you want to, you can add the as senior director of engineering at blah, blah, blah. I typically don't. I just stop right after the I enable warfighters to see in the dark. You can then add, in my current role, I've accomplished in one statement if you have the time. and I've previously worked for blah, 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 some other statements. Typically that first statement gets you enough credibility to then have the conversation, and people are usually intrigued to say, oh, what does that mean? And then you can go into these very simple sentences later if you want. So you can tailor the length of your speech based on how much time you have and how much you want to get into it, but I strongly suggest keeping it less than a minute and just making it intriguing, but also capturing the essence of an accomplishment or an impact from your role. Then you also want to research the company. And the amount of research you do varies depending on really what position you're trying to apply for and what you're doing. I work with some business development individuals, and for them, the research they do has to be actually more than when I'm looking to hire an engineer. So if I'm on an interview slate for a peer who might be working in the organization, I want to know, do they understand who our competitors are, what our market space is? Because that's their job. They're in business development. They have to have researched my company enough to understand what these things are. If I'm talking to an engineer candidate, they don't have to know that much about my company other than that, hey, we're a defense company and I'm happy. But they need to know a lot more about their specific skills and how they would apply them and scenarios in which they have applied them and demonstrate that. So the research on a company might also depend on the kind of role you're thinking about. If you're applying to be a CEO of a company, you better well have researched that company. You need to know what were their challenges, where are their weaknesses, what is their market standing, what is it that they're trying to go after. If you're applying to, be a janitor at a company, you probably don't need to know much beyond what the company's core business is. And then the other preparation that I think you need to do is to understand your minimums. All of us have some foundational things that we are willing to live with. Whether it's your salary, whether it's the commute, whether it's the number of days you have to be in the office, whether it's the type of roles that you have, what are your minimums? And this is a bit of self-reflection more than anything else. And I would really encourage everybody to spend the most time on that, because if you understand your minimums, you'll be able to understand how to evaluate the company that you go to interview for. You'll be prepared with questions because you'll want to understand how do they meet your minimums. You'll better negotiate because you know what you're going to walk away from because you know what your minimums are. So really spend some good time in understanding your minimums. And then, especially in the online world, check your equipment. Make sure you've test run the equipment. Make sure you know what platform is going to be used. On my computer, I have no less than 6 different online platforms. I have Zoom, Skype, WebEx, BlueJeans, Microsoft Teams, and something called Ring Central. So it depends on who I'm talking to, and I need to know what all of those platforms are. So before the interview, make sure you understand the equipment, what the tool they are going to use, how is it going to work. Have you tried it before? If not, ask a friend, hey, can we set up a Skype meeting just so I can check this out, so that you know that clicking the mute, unmute is through the space bar, or there's the button in the top left corner versus the button in the bottom right, or where information is really important nowadays with the online tools. There's just a huge variety of them, and it's good to know something to try out. Any questions on the prepare? All right, so practice. Practice means think about and anticipate the questions, craft stories, and role play. Similar to in prepare, where I think the most time should be spent on understanding your minimums. In practice, I think the most time should be spent on crafting stories. Ralph mentioned using table topics to be able to answer questions. The experience you get in Toastmasters answering table topic questions really does prepare you for an interview. And one of the best tricks for winning a table topics contest is having some pre-prepared answers. And you're thinking, wait a minute, table topics is a question I don't know what is being asked, and how do I have pre-prepared answers? Well, there's only so many human experiences Similarly, there's only so many skills ultimately when you boil it down. And so if you craft your stories around those skills and have them ready, you can apply them to almost any question that gets asked of you. It doesn't have to be the exact right answer, but it has to demonstrate that you understood the core intent. And on the next slide, I'm going to help you think about how to craft your stories. There's this great tool that I found online, and I'm going to share the actual, it's called Cracking the Soft Skills by a lady named Gail Luckman McDowell. And this is also where I got the idea about the 2-minute pitch, but Cracking the Soft Skills by Gail Luckman McDowell. She essentially says that you can craft 4 to 5 stories, and if you're an overachiever, do 6 or 7. But within those stories, you will easily be able to answer almost all of the interview questions given to you. Well, I think I'm not back on the, am I back on the main screen?
No, it says
Okay.
story.
Awesome. So the main themes that most people are looking for in a candidate: leadership and influence, mistakes and failures, challenges, teamwork, and successes. Like, can you demonstrate leadership and influence, which is essentially working in a team, whether that's a team of peers or a team of subordinates? Mistakes and failures, how do you deal with them? Have you had them? What are some examples? What did you do in those situations? Challenges, how do you deal with stress? How do you deal with the unknown? What is something that you've never encountered, and what do you do about it? Teamwork, how do you interact with people? How do you convince others to follow your lead? And successes, what are some of the accomplishments you've had in your life? So if you think about these 5 themes and come up with a story each, or a couple of stories each, maybe from the different jobs that you've had, you will probably be able to answer 95% of the questions that are posed to you, because you can use these stories to help you answer the questions. And the best thing about the stories is that we're all human beings, are natural storytellers to some extent. Like, if you have that idea in your brain, you'll be able to figure out which pieces of it apply to the question that were asked, right? So if somebody asked me, give me an example where your team did not meet a schedule, how did you get them past that situation? I could either pick a story from my mistakes and failures. At my previous job, we had a situation where blah, 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 or I can pick a story that I might have earmarked as a teamwork story, that I was managing a team of 25 people, and all of a sudden one of the individuals just wasn't pulling their weight, and it led to us not meeting this, and this is how I went about getting them back into the team, right? So depending on the stories that you have and the question you are get asked, you can decide which of the details that go with that story you share. So it's really just crafting the stories, understanding how that story demonstrates one of these themes. Maybe the same story demonstrates all 5 of them, and it's just different aspects of that story that you tell to emphasize a particular skill that you want to highlight. You want to make sure that the stories are substantial. That means that they're significant enough that you can draw from them, like you have a clear enough an idea of your experience in that story, that they're understandable, that they help explain why you did it. You can read the rest of the questions. So those are some of the questions you can ask yourself when you think of an example. What I would challenge each of you to do is to take these 5 themes and say, which job and what situation did I have to demonstrate leadership and influence? And once you have an idea, then start asking yourself this questions, you know, is the story actually demonstrating that leadership, or was it demonstrating lack of leadership? Is this demonstrating understandable, relatable? Can people, or do I have to get into so much detail that it's not going to be an easy way to explain? Or is it confidential, right? So all these things, once you think of the story, ask yourself the questions, and that will help you narrow it down to 4 or 5 or 6 stories. Once you have those stories, you're prepared. You could pretty much go into most interviews and pluck from your brain the story. And the nice thing about a story is they're yours. You should understand them already. You don't have to think too hard about them to pull from them. One of the strategies Jane gives in how to construct a story is what she calls this nugget situation action result. So she suggests you think or construct your stories, and you can even write all these down. I mean, the beauty for me of writing things down is that it helps me remember and helps me solidify how and what I want to share. For you, it might be just thinking through what is the key nugget of this story and where is it placed? Where is the scenario? What is the situation? And then the situation, you don't have to go into, you know, lots of detail like, oh, the guy was wearing a plaid shirt that day and it really was distracting me, but I was staying on focus. Like, not that kind of detail, but what it was the essence of the story. There were 3 individuals involved and this is the situation we had. The action is where you can expand, because that's an opportunity for you to shine and highlight the work you did, whether it was bringing the team together in a brainstorming session where you led the brainstorming scenario and you made sure everybody's voice was heard by calling on all the individuals in the room and really parsing the information that you heard and pulling it together, re-emphasizing it to the group. Like, that is the action. That's a story that I can share of a situation I had at work leading a team, and it gives you a lot of skills, right? It gives you a lot of sense about the skills. Oh, she knows how to lead a brainstorming session. She knows how to listen. She demonstrated the ability to synthesize information. She was able to get these members of the team to agree and come to consensus. All of those things can be demonstrated by a story, and then prove it with the result. That led us to an action plan, which enabled us to meet our customers' goals by delivering this product, you know, in the 3 days we had left. And then after you're done crafting these stories, you know, make sure you reconsider, what does the story say? And is it the point that you wanted to make? If it's not the point you wanted to make, find another story or change the way you're telling the story, right? But think back through that. I love this idea of very simple 5 key stories in these 5 key areas and construct them in this, you know, the situation, the action, the result scenario to really draw out how your skills would benefit a person. And I know, Cindy, you mentioned, you know, that your Eversource does cognitive type of interviewing, but you can even use this in cognitive interviewing, because a lot of cognitive interviewing is how do you apply knowledge in situations. Behavioral interviewing is ideally suited for stories, because in behavioral interviewing, people are looking for past behavior or past experience. Usually when somebody says, can you give me an example? Do you have a way to demonstrate that? Is there a situation where that happened to you? That's usually behavioral interviewing. For some roles, obviously, there's going to be tactical things. Like in one of our roles, if we bring in the electrical engineer, we actually draw a schematic and we ask them to identify, okay, you're not likely to get away with telling a story around like why you couldn't solve the circuit, but those are some different kind of fundamental skills. So you kind of have to know what you know that might be core tactical or fundamental skills. Justine, you know, if you go to a dentist office, you may not be able to talk your way around what is a molar versus what is a canine tooth. Like that may not be something, you might need to actually know that foundational data. But then beyond that, people are really looking for understanding how you'll work in their environment. And a lot of times when I'm interviewing senior engineers, I very quickly skip from the foundational to the how did you apply your knowledge, because at some point I have to assume they have some of the foundational skills because they've been in a role and in their career. So it's not that I'm spending, 30% of the interview time on the foundational skills, maybe only 5 or 10%, and then really understanding how can they apply it and learn new and do different and challenging situations, versus somebody graduating last week and I'm hiring, a new grad. I might spend like 60% of the interview thinking and talking about foundational skills. Like, can you understand this circuit? Can you decipher this line of code? What does this mean? So that's another thing to consider for everybody on the call here. We've, got a bit of a career. So I hope your interviewers are past the point of grilling you on what a molar versus a canine is, but maybe that's true, but you should know that already. So you don't need to prepare for it. Any questions on the stories? All right. And then the third area, presentation. This is the actual interview, and this is what happens at the interview. I like this idea, maybe of you've heard of Susan Cain. She did a lot of research around power poses, and this idea really intrigued me. So I followed her TED Talk and her book and done a little bit of research. And there is this science behind this idea. So this is probably my best tip out of all of this, because I think all the rest of it has been stuff you probably already knew, but this is my secret tip. Before you get into the presentation, do a power pose for 30 to 45 seconds. And a power pose can be as simple as sitting at your desk with your feet up, hands behind your back, all super. You could even do the super pose like this. You can do a super pose standing up, like you're in charge. You can be battling somebody, whatever your power pose that makes you feel grand and expansive and in control. Find that power pose. It could be standing with your hands on your hips as though you're Superwoman, Wonder Woman, whatever it is. The intent is to have your brain and your body have this feeling of, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I'm super confident. You may have words in the back of your mind saying, oh my gosh, I'm about to go into an interview. What the heck am I thinking? I'm really quell that with, I'm in charge, I'm in charge. If you have to say it out loud, say it out loud. The idea is to do that pose for 30 to 45 seconds. And there's quite a lot of research that it really changes your behavior. And maybe it's a little bit like Sharon's story early on of the person not feeling like they have a stake in the game or not feeling so anxious because it's not as important, is almost similar but different in that you sort of overcome that by saying, yeah, okay, I have a stake in the game, but I got it. This is mine. I am gonna go tackle it and go handle it. I'm sure there'll be doubt that creeps in, but that's okay. Just trust in the science here. Trust in the science. 30 to 45 seconds. And then maybe a second tip, tell the truth, but not the whole truth. There is no reason you have to tell the whole truth about anything. You should always be truthful and factual. But if you are in a scenario where it was challenging, you can simply say it was challenging. You don't have to say, and I broke down and I had to run out of the building because I couldn't handle the conversation anymore and people were looking for me for 3 days. Like, I don't have to tell that part. I can simply say it was a challenging situation. So tell the truth, but there's no need for you to always tell the whole truth. And so think about that. And that really changed how I started addressing answers to questions. So I always wanted to give a complete answer. You don't need to give a complete answer. You need to give a truthful answer. And it could be simply the answer that you need to shape to get to the question asked of you, right? So have you been in a challenging situation? Yes, I've been in several challenging situations. You don't have to follow it with the running out of the building screaming. Sharon.
Yeah, that reminds me that is a place where a lot of my clients had a tremendous amount of trouble because they were afraid of that question that would say something like, tell me about your worst problems in the work environment, or tell me about something that really challenged you when you were working. And so I told them, first of all, what is it? Talk to me. What's this thing that scares you so much? And then I would say to them, what did you do to solve it? How did you turn it around? Now, I have to say 50% of the time, the people would say to me, I didn't, I still do that. So I was like, okay, all right. let's pick something else then that's a challenge for you that you did turn around. And then when they ask you that question, you can say, well, I always had a problem with such and such until this here where I did this to fix it. And before you know it, you're talking about a skill of yours and not a problem. You've turned it around. Very much like a table topics question. You're talking about what you want to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then dress appropriately. And I put appropriately because it really depends on the role that you're applying for. There are situations where we have engineers who come in and we don't expect them to be in suits. In fact, I wouldn't expect some of my interviewees to come in suits unless they're applying for a management role, because that's not our culture. So if they had done the research on our company, they would know, you know, we tend to dress casually. There are some positions that you always want to wear a suit. If I was applying to be a foreman at a construction site, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe I just want to have a clean button shirt and khakis. So you have to dress appropriately for the role that you're applying for. Dress appropriately doesn't mean suit and tie and button collar shirts. Dress appropriately doesn't mean, you know, a business dress or gown. It means appropriate to the role and the position and the company and your position in it and all of those things and your style. All of those things play a factor. I would caution, you know, there are certain stereotypes and biases. So going in with, like, you know, 12-inch heels might not be the projection of a stereotype or bias or a natural inclination that you might want. So think about that. Is that appropriate to the business that you're applying for? Even if you would normally wear 12-inch heels, is it appropriate that everybody there is or isn't, you know? So maybe think about what appropriate means. Especially appropriate online. Now, I've seen a lot of everybody here has pretty good attire on, and the situation behind you is good. I remember many of you have seen my home setup with my bookshelf full of books where you can almost read all the titles on the books. I remember I was on not an interview call, but an interview for an article on a IEEE magazine, and the person said, "Oh, I didn't know you read that book." And I'm thinking, and they were distracted because the books were so close to the camera, they could actually read the titles. So, you know, you want to dress appropriately for your background, for your scenario, for online. Solids are very simple patterns are ideal. If you have stripes or check type of patterns, they tend to not transmit well over camera. The best type of a shirt is either a round collar or a square collar, like V-necks tend not to be ideal for online because just the movement you have and it also the way it gets presented. So think about simple colors, simple patterns, very simple designs, and make sure you're, you know, dressed reasonably. Like I did have somebody come in one time where they had flip-flops on, which isn't, you know, that big a deal. However, they were applying for a manufacturing type of a role. So you're working in a production environment. Flip-flops was not the ideal thing in a production environment. So they hadn't clearly thought through what the role was that was appropriate for them. And they had maybe, you know, dressed down a bit too much. And then once you're presenting, send thank you, say thank you, be appreciative of the opportunity. One of the things, it's a lot harder, I think, nowadays to send thank yous because you may not get everybody's interview or everybody on your interviews list information, but you can always send a thank you to the HR person who helped coordinate, and they'll forward it on. So you don't have to worry and be anxious about who exactly you spoke to, just who did you have the most interaction with in that interview process, and send them a thank you. And maybe this I added just simply because it's a pet peeve of mine when people don't acknowledge if you talk to them. So I feel very strongly that some sort of recognition of the time and the energy is important to be appreciative of. Any questions about the interview itself? Elena. Can't hear you.
About present, the last one, the interview itself, and I missed when you have to do PowerPoint or you have to think about it.
You
It's
have
like
to
you
do
don't
it.
do it.
You have to do it. You can't just think
How
about
can
it.
do it with a person who is interview you?
Oh, no, sorry. Present is still before the time you get there. So, you know, if
Oh, I
you're
mean,
like in the morning before your interview, or, you know, if
yeah.
you get to the facility 15, 20 minutes early, go into the restroom and do your power pose, and then you'll be all ready.
Okay.
You can
Got
try
it.
it
It's a
with
good
the
idea.
interviewer too. I mean, I guess it depends on what
Interesting.
tone you want to set, but I wouldn't recommend it. But you need to physically do the power pose to get the benefit.
Wow. Interesting.
But Nita, you're saying do the power pose in the restroom, not in the
Yeah.
office during the interview. I was a little unclear
Yes,
about that.
yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess it's in the wrong category because it really should be in prepare. But to me, prepare is long before the interview itself. And this is like, you know, somewhat immediate to the interview happening.
Yeah.
All right, so online, a couple of things. I think we've talked a lot about some of these already. The technology, as I said, make sure you understand the tool, the environment, and the internet connection. Make sure you've tested it out, you have a good feel for it. Those things can wreak havoc. But recognize it could wreak havoc for the other person too. So at the same time as you want to be prepared and know, if something goes wrong, don't sweat it. Just simply say, oh, I guess I wasn't expecting this to happen, or, oh, I apologize that it's not stable, but is there another way we can make it happen? And most of the time, the person you're talking to will say, oh yeah, I've had that happen to me before too. So it's very common nowadays. I can tell you that I've probably had as much technical problems when I've had an interview set up in the last month or two as the person coming on. But you do want to give it some fair, you know, chance of being successful by practicing and being aware of it. I did have an interview recently. The individual was not able to get to wherever they needed to get to, so they happened to be in their car, and they started the interviewing, and I think the car was actually moving, which completely freaked me out, because I said, do we need to stop? Do you need to, you know, pull over or something? They're like, oh, I'm almost there. And I said, I was thinking, I would much rather you have been a minute or two late than join the call. So that freaked me out. So, you know, be aware of things like that. But it was totally fine. That it was a weird setup, and that I could see, you know, his car in the background, and he was sitting in the driver's seat, and I could see the steering wheel because of the way he put the phone. That would have all been fine. It was just the fact that the car was moving.
Did he get a job?
The jump?
The job. I mean the job. He came for the job, for interview?
No, he did not get the job. Not only for
Okay.
that reason, but for other reasons. But it was just so bizarre. I'm like, just call a minute late. It's totally fine. I think people that you're talking to will be okay with all these things. If you have technical glitches, you're a minute or two late. Obviously, you don't want to be, you know, 5-10 minutes late, and hopefully you've logged in beforehand. But I think I would have been okay if he had simply joined a minute late and said, oh, I apologize. You can see that I'm in my car, but I had to get to a place I could stop. Like, that would have been a totally logical explanation and would have been okay. And then dress, we talked about it, solids, appropriate for the level. Speech, I have a trouble with this, so I'm not going to admonish anybody who may not be able to speak slowly. It is very difficult on internet connections to always catch all the words because of the bandwidth issues and the way the camera and the microphone might cut in and out. So you want to speak slowly, pause more often, listen more often in the conversation, especially online, and get comfortable with the pause and listening. Many times I will simply ask a question and wait, and the person will answer, and then I'll just still wait, and the person will keep going, and I'll still wait. And you can do the same thing to your interviewer. You can pose a question and wait, or give your answer and then wait. And usually, in most cases, if you're a little bit patient, the interviewer will go on to their next question, as opposed to waiting for you to start telling the whole truth.